Today's lecture is going to focus on the second meditation and Descartes' theory of perception that begins to emerge in that meditation. This is also the meditation where we get Descartes' rejection of imagination as a source of certainty, one that closes some of the holes that we found in the first meditation. So last time we saw that Descartes devoted the first meditation to a careful explanation for why sense perception cannot be the source of certainty. I framed that as a rejection of direct or naive realism. Through the method of doubt, Descartes discovered that there was much about sense perception as a source of true knowledge that couldn't be sustained if he rid himself of all ideas that were potentially false. At the end of the first meditation, we got an account for a way in which imagination might offer us a back door to certainty, or at least a kind of certainty. Surely, he imagines his common sense non-philosopher arguing, the basic building blocks of our mental imagery derives from an actual engagement with the world, even if we can't conclude for certain that we are actually engaging with that world in the here and now. This led him to speculate that what he called simple universals must be real, that is, things like extension, shape, quantity, color, etc. This idea isn't completely crazy. In fact, as I suggested last time, thinkers like Locke and Hume will present a very sophisticated philosophical argument that maintains precisely this. We also said last time that Descartes' position was perplexing, because he will later suggest that even these simple universals are innate. In the second meditation, we don't precisely get an argument for where those basic ideas originate, so much as an argument for why these simple universals that we find in the imagination are not the source of certainty. That is, they are not the source of knowledge or perception. The second meditation, then, gives us an argument that will rule out imagination as a source of certainty, just as he ruled out sense perception in the first meditation. We also get in this second meditation important information about what Descartes means when he talks about perception. Understanding what he means by that term helps us to make sense of the otherwise rather strange claim that perception does not come from sense perception. So for Descartes, perception is not grounded in either sense perception or imagination. Rather, perception is grounded in thinking, i.e., reason. For Descartes, perception is a fundamentally intellectual exercise, and it is grounded not in sensation or anything connected to sensation, such as, for example, the mental imagery in imagination. Descartes divorces perception from these. How can he maintain such a peculiar claim? Let's trace his steps. At the beginning of the second meditation, Descartes imagines his common sense observer being almost in a fit of despair. He's at peak doubt. He has concluded that he can no longer have any certainty in anything derived from the senses or through the senses. At first, this seems like a total loss of the possibility of certainty. First, a note. I'm using the Cambridge second edition throughout this presentation, not the early modern text version that you have from Quercus. And this applies to all the sensations in the rest of this presentation. From here on, I just cite the page numbers, always referring to the Cambridge second edition. But back to our story. Descartes begins the second meditation in a state that has rejected nearly everything he knows, or thought that he knew. He writes, I will suppose then that everything I see is spurious. I will believe that my memories tell me lies, that none of the things that it reports ever happened. I have no senses. Body, shape, extension, movement, and place are all chimeras. So what remains true? Perhaps just the one fact that nothing is certain. But suddenly there is a light of hope. He knows he must exist. This is where we get Descartes' most famous line, "I think, therefore I am." He concludes that if he is doubting, it must be the case that he is something. Suddenly one thing is certain: he exists. Why is this so certain, so solid? Because its contrary is a logical contradiction. Logically, it is impossible for someone to conclude that they themselves, as a thinking thing, does not exist. This does not mean that he has a body. It doesn't mean that he can draw any conclusions about the physical makeup about himself, at least not yet. But it does mean one indubitable thing. If he is thinking, then he is a thing that thinks. Here's how he puts it. Am I not so bound up with a body and with senses that I cannot exist without them? But I have convinced myself that there is absolutely nothing in the world, no sky, no earth, no minds, no bodies. Does it now follow that I too do not exist? No. If I convinced myself of something, then I certainly existed. But there is a deceiver of supreme power and cunning who is deliberately and constantly deceiving me. And let him deceive me as much as he can. He will never bring it about that I am nothing so long as I think that I am something. So after considering everything very thoroughly, I must finally conclude that this proposition, I am, I exist, is necessarily true whenever it is put forward by me or conceived in my mind. I think, therefore I am. This is Descartes' most famous passage. My goal with this course is to avoid too much repetition of Phil 210. So I want to bring your attention to how this phrase, I think, therefore I am, fits into Descartes' theory of perception. So I'm going to draw your attention to one rather long sentence that appears at the end of the second meditation, which I think summarizes nicely Descartes' thesis for the second meditation, and that indicates how he is going to proceed in his hunt for certainty. What we get from this sentence that I'm about to read is Descartes' rationalist theory of perception. It explains to us how it is that Descartes can separate perception from sense perception. He writes, I now know that even bodies are not strictly perceived by the senses or the faculty of imagination, but by the intellect alone. And that this perception derives not from their being touched or seen or from their being understood. And in view of this, I know plainly that I can achieve an easier and more evident perception of my own mind than of anything else. With that passage, I've jumped us to the very end of the second meditation, to the conclusion of his analysis, where he decides definitively that perception is strictly the purview of the intellect, i.e. of reason. So how does he think it's possible that the intellect and not sensation is responsible for perception? First of all, this is possible because Descartes redefines the word perception in a way that gives it less to do with sensation and more to do with thinking. So this is what we have to keep in mind. When Descartes uses the word perception, he does not mean sense perception. This is important to recognize. What he means by perception is an awareness of what is real or true. This makes the word perception a success term. That means that you don't have to have perception of things that are, that means that you don't have perception of things that are dubious. It only gets to be called perception if it is actually grounded in some kind of certainty. You only perceive or have a perception of what is true in Descartes' terms. In other words, this version of the word perception is, in a sense, the equivalent of knowledge. This isn't entirely out there. In our present-day philosophy of mind, there is an argument for effectively, in a certain sense, the same thing. Present-day philosophers might disagree, or they would disagree, that we should make the word perception the equivalent of knowledge. But they do argue that the word perception should be limited to cases of actual engagement with a really existing and present external world. And in that sense, perception is, to a certain extent, in today's philosophy, understood as a success term. But why does Descartes make this connection between perception and knowledge? To get this, we have to remember that Descartes' project is to search for rules of evidence and for certainty. What we're looking for is a solid foundation of knowledge. We want to know if what we think we know is real or not. We want to know if we can trust our knowledge as having some solid foundation in what is real. So take the clip of A Christmas Carol that I showed you in the last video. On this account of perception, Scrooge cannot have a perception of the ghost of Jacob Marley. He can only have a perception of what he is certain exists. Now, Scrooge is definitely having a perception when he's visited by the ghost, but what he is perceiving is that he's having some kind of experience in that moment of being visited by the ghost. He's feeling something, that's certain. But the ghost itself, as a visual representation, that isn't a perception. So with this redefinition of perception, the field of what constitutes perception has become very narrow. This is especially so for Descartes' imagined observer at this stage of the meditations. So far, he's only found one thing of certainty, himself. Specifically, himself as a thinking thing. He still has no perception of himself as having a body or being physical in any way. Why? Because he hasn't proven that yet, that that is true. All he's proven is that he is a thing that thinks. He at least exists, and of that he can be certain. That is the one thing so far that Descartes' imagined observer has that can constitute knowledge, i.e. perception. He perceives his own existence because in order for him to be able to do any kind of wondering, thinking, or doubting, he must have some kind of I that can do those things. Let's return to that sentence at the end of the meditations that I said was its thesis and look at it more closely. He said, "And this perception derives not from their being touched or seen, but from their being understood. And in view of this, I know plainly that I can achieve an easier and more evident perception of my own mind than of anything else." What is he saying here? He's saying that this first and most fundamental perception did not have anything to do with physical sensation, not touching or seeing, but of understanding. What does this suggest? It suggests that the object of which we have the best certainty, the most solid knowledge, isn't external to us. What is most solid as a foundation for knowledge is our own minds. This is why he argues that nothing is easier or more evident as a perception than his own mind. So, okay, there's a lot to question there. Do we really know our own minds? What about all the things that go on inside our heads that makes no sense to us? But for now, let's just take him on his word and try to understand what he means. Because he's going to use that foundation, that we know our own minds, to explain to us how we know about external objects. That seems like a big leap, but he does give us a careful step-by-step argument for how he comes to that conclusion. He gets from what is inside his mind to what is outside by investigating what it is that he does know for certain about himself. And right now, that has nothing to do with the subconscious or other unknown aspects of the mind. He sticks strictly to what it is about himself as a thinking thing that he does know for certain. So he starts off his investigation by recognizing that his first job is to create a picture of this I, i.e., of the mind that he now recognizes he must have. He says, "But I do not yet have a sufficient understanding of what this I is. That now necessarily exists." Just like he did in the first meditation, Descartes carefully considers proposals about what he knows for certain inside of himself and how he knows it, and he eliminates the elements of those proposals that are subject to doubt. He writes, "I will therefore go back and meditate on what I originally believed myself to be, before I embarked on this present train of thought. I will then subtract anything capable of being weakened, even minimally, by the arguments now introduced, so that what is left at the end may be exactly and only what is certain and unshakable." Just like in the first meditation, he begins with what he takes to be the common sense view as a starting point. He suggests that the most plausible common sense starting point for what he himself is that he has a body and that he engages in both sense perception and thinking. But right off the bat, there's a problem. The first meditation has already given him a solid argument for doubting two of those three elements. So if what he is a thing that has a body, B, sensation, and C, thinking, he already knows that the first two are not under the category of certainty. Remember that he began the second meditation with the premise that he has no body and no shape. Of course, he might have these, but remember, we're not looking for things that might be true. We're looking for things that are definitely true. The first meditation found that it was possible that he was dreaming, and so everything that he thought he was sensing, he was in fact only imagining. He writes, "Sense perception, surely this does not occur without a body, and besides, when asleep, I have appeared to perceive through the senses many things which I afterwards realized I did not perceive through the senses at all." Also, if he's ruled out that he has a body, then that means that he also, ipso facto, ruled out sensation. So all that he knows about this thing that he is, the I that he knows exists, is that it is a thing that thinks. Descartes proposes that as far as he knows, he could well cease to exist the moment he stops thinking. Some have taken that statement to suggest that Descartes holds the absurd proposal that when your mind goes blank, that you disappear. But that's not his meaning. He shouldn't be taken literally as suggesting that his existence is contingent on his thinking. It's just that at this stage of the meditations, that's the only thing he has guaranteeing his existence. He needs to build out from there, from that solid cornerstone, to establish that his existence has some kind of permanence. He writes, "But for all that, I am a thing which is real and which truly exists." The fact that he is thinking is his only access to himself as something that is real at this stage of the meditations. So now there's a question. What is it exactly that has made this discovery that he exists possible in the first place? If he can answer that, then he will know what it is that is a baseline rule of evidence for reality. If he can dissect what gave him certainty of the one and only thing of which he is certain, then he can draw some conclusions about what the source of certainty So here's the common sense proposal that he will test and eventually eliminate over the course of the second meditation. Is the source of the certainty that he exists derived from the imagination? He's going to show that no, that can't be it. He writes, if the I is understood strictly as we have been taking it, then it is quite certain that knowledge of it does not depend on things of whose existence I am as yet unaware. So it cannot depend on any of the things which I invent in my imagination. So his first point is that knowledge of the I is foundational. He's argued that it is the first point of certainty. The imagination proposal, that this knowledge comes from the imagination, would mean that something else, something prior, is what gives him this knowledge. But that can't be right. The certainty he finds in the I think, therefore I am, can't come from those things because they must be things that come after the discovery of the I. If that was a bit unclear or obscure, the second point helps it make more sense. Imagination, in the sense Descartes means, applies only to thoughts derived from sensation, i.e., the imagination concerns itself with imagery of corporeal, meaning physical things. But the I isn't in the realm of the physical. We're not talking about the body or anything to do with the body. We're talking about a non-physical consciousness. The imagination, which necessarily follows from physical sensation, just isn't applicable here. This is his first reference to a point that I will emphasize more in a future video when we get to Meditation 6 and to Hobbes. Descartes sees a clear distinction between imagination and the intellect. These are not the same faculty. As I noted above, the imagination, in Descartes' use of the term, is derived from sensation. It involves mental pictures that are based on previous sensation. But the intellect, Descartes argues, is not reliant on sensation. The intellect has its own tools, namely reason, thought, logic, etc., that allows it to find a non-sensory-based kind of certainty. The case Descartes is making is that this non-sensory kind of basis for knowledge is far more solid and foundational for achieving certainty than sensation or its sister faculty, imagination, is. So what Descartes has done here is flip the common sense argument that the imagination has its roots in sensation on its head. Remember that claim was that the basic components of mental imagery must come from the real world. These basic elements are things like extension, shape, quantity, and color, etc. But here's the problem with that proposal, at least on Descartes' account. The single one thing that he has certainty about, that he is thinking, involves none of these simple universals. The I has nothing to do with extension, shape, quantity, or color. He notes that the imagination can't even picture what the I is. Try it. Can you get a mental picture of your sense of personal identity? What does your I look like? If you're getting a mental picture of what you look like in the mirror, then you're just proving Descartes' point. The I is not your body. It is your soul, i.e. your consciousness. But there is no mental picture for what consciousness is. It's just not that kind of thing. So this is strike one for the imagination as a source of knowledge and certainty. There will be another. So Descartes concludes that the first problem with the imagination is that it does not allow you to conceive of the mind. This is a problem because the fact that he has a mind is so far the only thing that he knows, or, in Descartes' terms, that he perceives. Here's why the imagination can't do that, apart from the two reasons we explored a minute ago. The imagination is not something that observes the mind. Imagining is something the mind does. It would be like the eye trying to see itself. It doesn't work that way. So here's a list of things that he is starting to know about this mysterious eye. As a thinking thing, it does certain things. The eye can doubt, understand, affirm, deny, will, and also imagine and have sensory perception. Suddenly, imagination and sense perception are folded into the intellect. They do not precede thought, they are thought. This leads to an important conclusion. Now we're no longer looking at the outside world for certainty. We're looking within. Thoughts attain a priority in our hunt for certainty and knowledge. That means that perception, as Descartes is defining it, is found within the realm of thought. He writes, "The fact that it is I who am doubting and understanding and willing is so evident that I see no way of making it any clearer. But it is also the case that the I who imagines is the same I. For even if, as I have supposed, none of the objects of the imagination are real, the power of imagination is something which really exists and is part of my thinking." So not only is imagination within the realm of thoughts, something that the mind does, but so is sense perception. He writes, "Lastly, it is also the same I who has sensory perceptions, or is aware of bodily things, as it were, through the senses. For example, I am now seeing light, hearing a noise, feeling heat. But I am asleep, so all this is false. Yet I certainly seem to see, to hear, and to be warmed. What is called having a sensory perception is strictly just this. And in this restricted sense of the term, it is simply thinking." See what he just did there? What matters is not whether he's actually seeing or hearing or feeling. What matters is that he's having the thought that he's doing so. Let's look at that again, just the highlighted section. "Yet I certainly seem to see, to hear, and to be warmed." Seeming is what matters here, not whether he's dreaming or not. And this is why he can say that having a sensory perception is really about thinking. He's restricted the scope of perception down to just what is certain. Whether or not Scrooge was seeing the ghost of Jacob Marley isn't the question anymore. Scrooge's senses may be dubious, but the thought that he is seeing a ghost is not. Whether or not there is a ghost in front of him, what Scrooge can know for certain is that he's having a certain thought. A thought that says, I am potentially being confronted by a ghost right now. And in this restricted sense, perception is indeed simply thinking. So he's redefined perception to apply only to the thoughts associated with experiencing and not with the engagement with the object itself. Earlier I said that thinking of perception as a success term is not uncommon among today's philosophers, but here Descartes is in a totally different realm of thought. Today's philosophers would not dissociate perception from external engagement. But what Descartes is arguing here, what today's philosophers would have a real problem with, is that the perception that is happening when Scrooge encounters the ghost of Jacob Marley is the perception that he's having a perception. And that's it. And if this is the case, then perception really doesn't have to do with physical sensation. It has to do with thinking about having sensations. So whether the world is really there or not is not the centrally important thing anymore. What is central is the intellectual experience that you're having. So Descartes' conclusion so far just reinforces his original conclusion, that he is a thinking thing, and that he necessarily exists. It also shows that the mind is the true ground of certainty. This is the conclusion he draws in that statement that I said this meditation's thesis that in view of this, I know plainly that I can achieve an easier and more evident perception, i.e. knowledge, of my own mind than anything else. But Descartes doesn't just stop there. After all, scientific certainty surely must include knowledge of things more than just yourself. So he moves from the conclusion that he knows he's having an experience of some kind to an argument for how we can apply the intellect as a source of certainty for external objects as well as internal ones. Now we'll look at how Descartes argues that the intellect, not sensation or imagination, gives you knowledge or perception of objects. How does he do this? He turns his attention to the nature of wax as an example of how the intellect is critically involved in our knowledge of objects, more so than the fallible senses and imagination. Let me read Descartes' own words about what he thinks is illustrative about an experience of a stick or a ball of wax. He writes, "Let us take, for example, this piece of wax. It has just been taken from the honeycomb. It has not quite lost the taste of the honey. It retains some of the scent of the flowers from which it was gathered. Its color, shape, and size are plain to see. It is hard, cold, and can be handled without difficulty. If you rap it with your knuckle, it makes a sound. In short, it has everything which appears necessary to enable a body to be known as distinctly as possible. But even as I speak, I put the wax by the fire and look. The residual taste is eliminated. The smell goes away. The color changes. The shape is lost. The size increases. It becomes liquid and hot. You can hardly touch it. And if you strike it, it no longer makes a sound. But does the same wax remain? It must be admitted that it does. No one denies it. No one thinks otherwise. So what was it in the wax that I understood with such distinctiveness? Evidently none of the features which I arrived at by the senses. For whatever came under taste, smell, sight, touch, or hearing has now altered. Yet the wax remains." So here's the question he's asking. Nobody is confused about the fact that the melted wax is the same as the solid wax. But why exactly is that? What gives us that certainty? It's not sensation. It can't be, because all the sensory points of reference have changed. What was originally one shape is now another. What was once one color is now a different color. The smell has changed, the feeling has changed. Everything physical about the wax is not the same. If we were just relying on sensation, we'd have no idea that the two things, the melted and the solid wax, are one and the same thing. Sensation isn't it then? But what about imagination? Perhaps that is what's giving us the awareness of the continuity between the two states of the wax. Here's where we get Descartes' second attack on the idea that the imagination gives us some certainty because the most basic elements in our imagination have to be real. These are our simple and universal things: shape, extension, color, etc. Not there either. Even these most basic elements are not continuous between the solid and the melted wax. Here's Descartes' explanation. Is it what I picture in my imagination, that this piece of wax is capable of changing from a round shape to a square shape, or from a square shape to a triangular shape? Not at all, for I can grasp that the wax is capable of countless changes of this kind, Yet I'm unable to run through this immeasurable number of changes in my imagination, from which it follows that it's not the faculty of imagination that gives me my grasp of the wax as flexible and changeable. Again, remember that we're looking for certainty. But the imagination is no help to us here. Extension, shape, color are all changed. So that's one side of Descartes' complaint about imagination. It comes down to his argument about sensation. Nothing about the physical nature of the wax allows us to connect the solid and the melted. But there's another part of his argument, one that applies exclusively to the imagination's limitations. Here's a point that we will see again. The imagination, because it is based on mental imagery of what we have seen before, has a more limited reach than the intellect. When he thinks about the melted wax, he realizes that it could take on any number of unpredictable possible shapes. But the imagination can only visualize a fraction of those possibilities. Clearly, the intellect, which is not reliant on mental pictures drawn from experience, is doing the work here in telling him that the melted wax could shape itself in any one of a myriad of ways. His awareness of the possibilities of the wax's shape, he thinks, is essential to our understanding of what wax is. He writes, "And what is meant by extended? Is it the extension of the wax? Is the extension of the wax also unknown? For it increases if the wax melts, increases again if it's boiled, and is greater still if the heat is increased. I would not be making a correct judgment about the nature of wax unless I believed it capable of being extended in many more different ways than I will ever encompass in my imagination." So what's his point? His point is that the imagination is not the fundamental source of our awareness of the wax. What we know about the wax is being drawn from the intellect, from reason, from thought, and not from a sensation-based kind of imagination. If that were the case, we'd only be able to formulate an awareness of the wax to the extent that we can formulate a precise mental picture of its possibilities. I'm going to return to this argument in a future video. He makes a more credible defense of it in the 6th meditation. Meanwhile, as I'll get to then, Hobbes also makes a strong argument against Descartes' thinking here, which I will also talk about later this week. Suffice it to say for now that the thought this melted wax is the same as the solid wax, he argues, is a purely intellectual one. He concludes, "I must therefore admit that the nature of this piece of wax is in no way revealed by my imagination, but is perceived by the mind alone." So that's strike 2 against the imagination as a source of certainty. He concludes that the intellect, i.e. the faculty of reason, is what allows him to perceive, i.e. have knowledge of, the wax. Now, he's not saying that the wax of the intellect is separate from the wax that he senses physically or that he pictures mentally. His point is that what allows him to know for certain that the solid and the melted wax are one and the same, and that the wax has certain properties that allows it to melt and to take on different shapes and so on, is not the faculty of the imagination, but rather the faculty of reason. He writes, "And yet, and here is the point, the perception I have of the wax is a case not of vision or touch or imagination, nor has it ever been, despite previous appearances, but of pure mental scrutiny. And this can be imperfect and confused, as it was before, or clear and distinct, as it is now, depending on how carefully I concentrate on what the wax consists in." Now, there's still a slight wrinkle. He just acknowledged that our ideas about things are not infallible. Remember that I said perception is a success term? But he just told us that our ideas of things can be vague and confused. Concluding that our knowledge comes from mental scrutiny hasn't solved all our problems. Our thinking isn't perfect. Our thoughts can be imperfect and confused, and that doesn't sound like a good foundation for knowledge either. What we want are a certain kind of thought, thoughts that are precise and accurate. What we want are what he calls clear and distinct perceptions, meaning we want thoughts that can actually tell us what is real. So he recognizes a new thing about this mind that he now knows for certain exists, and also has concluded is the source of our knowledge about not just ourselves, but also about the nature of objects. The mind, too, is fallible. He writes, "But as I reach this conclusion, I am amazed at how weak and prone to error my mind is." Sometimes our thinking is solid, like the thought that he is a thinking thing that necessarily exists. Sometimes it's prone to error. So a new pressing problem has shown itself. What is the difference between thoughts that are imperfect and confused and those that are clear and distinct? He goes back to his method. He first considers what the common sense observer might think. In doing so, he briefly regresses into thinking that the senses perhaps are, after all, the final arbiter in telling us what the wax is really like. He says, "We say that we see the wax itself if it is there before us, not that we judge it to be there from its color or shape. And this might lead me to conclude without more ado that knowledge of the wax comes from what the eye sees, not from the scrutiny of the mind alone." But once again, he realizes that this cannot be right. The senses they can't arbitrate between what is real and what is not. That has already been shown in the first meditation. It isn't sensation that tells us what's real. It's judgment. We judge that something is real. i.e., deciding whether something is real or not is something that we can only do as an act of thought. We judge whether something is really there or not. And judgment is a function of the faculty of reason, not of sensation or imagination. He writes, "Yet do I see any more than hats and coats which could conceal automatons? I judge that they are men. And so something which I thought I was seeing with my eyes is in fact grasped solely by the faculty of judgment, which is in my mind." Now remember that how he has defined perception. Perception is equated with true knowledge. The senses are not involved in that. The senses just pick up on sensory impressions. The imagination can mimic, distort, or rearrange these impressions in a way that we can't always distinguish from actual sensation. The only thing that can make that kind of call is judgment. We use our reasoning faculties to compile evidence, think about what makes logical sense, and make a judgment about whether it makes sense that we are being visited by a ghost or not. What does this tell him? Here I'm summarizing the conclusions of the second meditation. What does the realization that it is the faculty of judgment that is the arbiter of whether something is real or not tell him? It's that A, he's having an experience within his mind and that he's thinking, and therefore he must necessarily exist. And B, that he uses a function of the intellect, i.e. judgment, to determine whether that experience is of something real or not. Therefore, if perception equals knowledge of what is certain, then perception is derived not from sensation or the imagination, but from the intellect. Here's Descartes' wording of that deduction. Then although my judgment may still contain errors, at least my perception now requires a human mind. For if I judge that the wax exists from the fact that I see it, clearly this same fact entails much more evidently that I myself also exist. It is possible that what I see is not really the wax. It's possible that I do not even have eyes with which to see anything. But when I see or think I see, here I'm not distinguishing the two, it's simply not possible that I who am now thinking am not something. So now we've gotten somewhere. First of all, we have one thing of certainty, our own existence as a thinking thing. And second of all, we know that the faculty of judgment is an essential part of our hunt for certainty. All we need to know now is how we decide that our judgments are correct. It's that same question that we saw earlier. What is the difference between mental scrutiny that is imperfect and confused, and that which is clear and distinct? And we now have a new question. What is the criteria for clear and distinct judgment? And this brings us to Frankfurt's chapter number 12. The next lecture will look at Frankfurt's argument for what Descartes means by clear and distinct, and what criteria applies to each of those terms. So I'm going to stop there for today. In the syllabus I said that we'd be covering meditations 3 and 4, but I think meditation 2 was plenty for today. We'll cover the rest of it in the next video. Hope that was clear, everybody. I hope that you'll check in on Thursday for our interactive BB Collaborate session at 3 p.m. And feel free to contact me if you have any questions. And don't forget about the reading quiz that's due by midnight on Monday, May 11th. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.